If you're in the middle of an identity shift, right, a leadership identity shift, and you're struggling a little bit with maybe it's feeling like you're a little bit of fraud, you're a little bit faking it, right? Because it doesn't feel natural. It feels like you're trying to be someone you're not. It feels inauthentic. This video is going to give you a way of thinking of authenticity in a way that makes sense during that transition into that identity, that leadership identity that you really want to transform into. I've worked with so many leaders who've had every credential, every achievement, and yet they still feel like they're faking it, like they're performing every single step of the way that they're doing. They don't feel like it is who they are. It doesn't feel natural to them. They feel like they're performing instead of living it. And what I found every single time was that this feeling of performance, this uncomfortable feeling that they would get, wasn't an evidence of they were a fraud, which is what they felt like. It was more evidence of that they were growing into that ideal version of themselves that they wanted to be. So in this video, I want to talk about that feeling, that fraud feeling, that icky feeling that you feel when you're trying to become a version of yourself that doesn't quite feel natural to you yet. And what authenticity actually means when you're actively trying to change who you are, actively trying to become that next version of you, that ideal version that you see for yourself. So let's start there, right? What is that ideal version that you see for yourself? For me, it was, I want to stop over-explaining myself. I want to show up more confident. I want to be able to speak up in meetings where I'm no longer terrified and I'm able to think through my thoughts and convey those clearly. I want to stop shrinking myself, right? When someone pushes back, I want to have that executive presence that people want to naturally follow as a leader. But almost immediately, as soon as I try to embody that version of myself that I see, I start feeling that little voice in the back of my head asking, are you being fake? Are you performing this? Are you being inauthentic? Is this even me? And so a perspective change that you can do is, instead of listening to that little voice and thinking of it as a little bit of a threat, maybe start thinking of it as a growth sign. Oh, I'm feeling that uncomfortable, icky feeling, but actually it's because I'm embodying the person that I want to be. And right now it doesn't feel natural. I feel really uncomfortable, but it means that I'm growing. Because when you're in the middle of a shift, when you're in the middle of an identity shift, you're not fluent in that new version of yourself yet. You should be quite uncomfortable. Growth is uncomfortable. The words seem maybe slightly off. They maybe don't feel like your own. The silences feel uncomfortable. You feel like you have to fill every silence instead of feeling comfortable in the silence. You probably often leave all conversations replaying them over and over and over again in your head. At least I do. Just wondering where you could have done something better. How did the other person take what you said? How could it have been taken differently? How could you have improved? How could you have maybe done better during that conversation? And you're probably also wondering, I was really trying to embody this version of myself that I saw. Did they see through me, right? Did they see through the fact that I was performing, that it wasn't real, that it was maybe a little bit rehearsed during that time period? But you got to stop seeing that discomfort as evidence that you're being inauthentic, right? You got to stop seeing it as, oh my gosh, I'm being fake. You got to start seeing it with this new perspective. It's evidence that I'm actually intending to grow, that I'm actually making action towards this growth, towards this transition, towards this identity shift. Think about all the skills that you've acquired, right? Especially if you're already in a leadership role. Think about all the leadership skills that now feel natural to you, but they didn't at first. Public speaking, speaking in a group setting, speaking in meetings, running complex projects and dealing with multiple stakeholders, coordinating with multiple people, having to cold call people. I mean, our generation doesn't just pick up the phone. We send a message, a text message, an email, and then we set up a time to talk, right? But you've acquired these skills little by little. And if you're in a management role, you've definitely already started to have difficult conversations, right? And every difficult conversation starts to feel a little easier. At least that's the transition that I'm doing right now, where all of these difficult conversations that have to do with managing people at first felt nerve-wracking. I would think about it for nights. I wouldn't be able to sleep. I'd think through it through my commute. I'd, think through it on the train and write down scripts and all these things. And yet these difficult conversations kept happening very often, very consistently. So slowly I acquired that skill. I acquired this is just another difficult conversation, and I no longer get nervous. I no longer have to overthink it. I no longer have to over prepare because it's now starting to feel natural. It's a skill that I've acquired. And yes, obviously, the first 6 months of doing it, it always felt like I was performing. It always felt like I had rehearsed, even over rehearsed sometimes. And as you're developing your leadership identity, that is no different. That icky feeling, that uncomfortable feeling that you're being inauthentic, that you're a fraud even, it's just the feeling of you not yet being fluent. And it'll pass eventually with more evidence, with more practice, with every day that you're going through it little by little. And as you're going through that identity shift, every day as you're embodying those identity shifts, those behavioral patterns that you want to embody, they're going to start feeling more natural. But here's where it gets a little bit more complicated, right? Because it's not just the feeling of learning something new. It's not just the feeling of learning that new skill and going through the discomfort until you're better at it, right? The whole issue with trying to balance having this identity shift, this shift into this leadership identity that you want, and maintaining who you are as a person, maintaining that authenticity as a person, is the whole conflict here. Because the deeper question is, which version of me is the real version? But I think I want to challenge that question directly because I think it's the wrong question to even ask yourself, to even want to answer. Here's a personal example. Early in my career, I thought authenticity is it. And in order for me to be authentic, I have to be fully myself. And for me to be fully myself, it kind of meant that I overshared a lot of myself. I overshared many personal things. I was an oversharer with my colleagues, my bosses, with anyone in my career, honestly. I gave too much of myself too soon. I shared all my personal stories. I shared my struggles. I shared all those deep things that probably make people uncomfortable the first time that you tell them. They don't really know what to say, especially when it comes from someone like me with such a traumatic past. I was so open about it. And while all of these things were true, I was confusing providing all of me with being authentic. I just honestly believed that authenticity meant being completely open. What I didn't understand when I was young was that I was handing pieces of myself to people that hadn't earned them yet. And unfortunately, some of those people formed opinions of me, of my competence, before they got to work with me. And then I started understanding that I wasn't being authentic. I was just being unguarded. The lesson there is obvious, right? Very few people deserve to know you fully. And that was a lesson that I had to learn over 10 years. But once I did learn it, I learned that just because I'm not sharing myself fully doesn't mean that I'm not being authentic, right? Because what didn't change when I decided to stop oversharing was my warmth, how open and approachable I am just naturally, how I create relationships, how I like to lead with harmony and kindness, even though at one point I thought that was a weakness. So I became more intentional about what I shared and with whom without really changing those authentic character traits that make me me, and that I wanted to take into that leadership identity that I eventually wanted to adopt. Really, that intentionality helped me become more of who I was while shifting into this leadership role, leadership transition, leadership identity that I wanted to have. So when you ask yourself, which version of me is real? Which one is the authentic me? I kind of want you to think that the version of you that overshares, for me, the one that overexplains, the one that overworks, the one that shrinks, I want you to think about how maybe that version of you maybe isn't also your authentic self. Maybe that version of you was a version that you adopted in order to survive, in order to get through that survival mode that you needed to do to get to where you are now. You adopted that version of you for an environment that you were living through. It was a different environment, right? That you were surviving through, not one where you were a leader. And for those of us who are first generation immigrants and who did go through this survival mode, and everyone has a different story, most of us have gone through the survival periods of our lives to get to where we are. We learned that it was much safer adapting than standing out. And that adapted version of ourselves was necessary in order to get us where we are now. But the thing is, that isn't going to be the whole story. That's not the end of your story. And so now we kind of have to work on that release. And so now that I've gotten down this rabbit hole about the survival mode and being a first generation, being an immigrant, and getting from, who you were, trying to get to the version of you that is now that you're in corporate, now that you're a leader, I kind of want to talk about something that doesn't really quite get talked about a lot in leadership content. And that is that for a lot of us, becoming that ideal version of ourselves, becoming that success that we see in our future, means leaving things behind. That feels a little bit like betrayal. It makes us feel a little bit guilty. When you start carrying yourself different and it starts feeling more natural and it stops really feeling like you're doing that hard code switch, because now you're doing that code switch more fluently. Now you're taking up space naturally. Now you're leading meetings without even a second thought. You're in rooms that your parents never entered. There's that guilt that starts creeping in, like you're trading something for something else, like you're trading that corner office for your culture, for who you were. You're moving away from something. Sometimes leaving behind that version of yourself that grew in the survival mode feels like you're leaving behind a little bit of your history, a little bit of your culture. At least that's how it felt with me. It's something that I had to work on a lot. I had a big guilt complex. I had to learn that staying in that version of myself that was adopted, that was a smaller version of myself because it had a lot of behavioral patterns that I wanted to get away from. Like I said, oversharing, the overworking, the toxic mentality around how much work I should be doing, how my self-worth is tied to my performance. I wanted to leave that behind because I knew that was the only way that was going to get me to growth, that was going to get me to the success that I wanted for myself, to that leadership identity, more than that leadership identity, that identity of myself that I wanted. But staying in those old patterns of you, and so that you stay recognizable, that isn't loyalty, that's self-abandonment. And it's self-abandonment dressed up as belonging, dressed up as loyalty towards your culture, your family, all of that. The way that I like to think about it is that my family didn't sacrifice all of these things in order for me to hold myself back, to self-sabotage. I really try to think about becoming that version of myself is the more authentic version because I'm doing with intentionality. But there is that external piece that you're going to hear from others, right? Because when people start not recognizing you, it starts feeling like a threat to their own identity. People around you will notice that you hold yourself differently, that you walk through the world a little bit differently, and they're not exactly going to like it or love it. A lot will, right? You're going to have a great support system, but there's going to be a handful of people that aren't going to love it. I mean, especially if you brought that survival mode in with you into your professional career, your colleagues might start feeling uncomfortable with the version of you that doesn't shrink when they push back, right? Also, your family might start wondering why you're acting a little bit different while you're a little more secure in yourself. And there are going to be people who say you've changed like it's an accusation. But that's just because the people in your life are calibrated to that old version of you. When you shift, it disrupts their system. And unfortunately, that disruption is about their own comfort rather than the validity of who you're becoming. Just a little side note. You don't owe anyone the version of yourself that was easier to manage. So, okay, back to the original question. How do you hold authenticity? How do you hold that authentic you in balance while you're trying to do this identity shift? Because it seems contradictory, right? The way that I think about it, actually, I like to think that authenticity is when you're doing something really from intention, not from a pattern or from a habit, from those behavioral patterns, from those habits that you had. For me, I'm being more authentic when I know what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. and choosing that deliberately rather than defaulting to my previous behavioral patterns, right? I'm being more authentic to myself internally when I can tell myself, I don't want to be defensive and I want to adopt a version of myself that isn't defensive, right? Versus my default mode, which is being defensive, when afterwards I have this internal conflict where I am angry with myself because I defaulted to defensiveness rather than moving towards the intentional version of myself that is not defensive. That's when I feel more imbalanced. That's when I feel more authentic, when I'm intentional about my habits, my behavior patterns, about who I want to be. And, going back to growing through that survival mode, getting past the survival mode, I honestly believe that the most authentic thing you can do is leave behind those behavioral patterns that you adopted that became default while you were growing, while you were surviving. Because that version of yourself was built to survive. And now you can start practicing with intentionality the version of yourself that was meant to lead. All right, that's it. That's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you subscribe as well. I'll see you in the next one. Bye, everyone.